Welcome back to the BDD 101 series. I'm Wynne, and this time we're going to be talking about examples, the power of examples. We've got four main topics we're going to cover today. First of all, the anatomy of an example, because as you may not be aware, we can really break down an example into three clean pieces. Then we'll talk about the benefits of working with examples, how they're helpful. We'll talk about a pattern for collaborating around collecting examples and a specific way to run a workshop called example mapping. Every example starts in a context. For example, say we're building an ATM, the software for a teller where an automated teller machine where you get cash from the bank. The context might be that we start out with $1,000 in our account. Then, in the context, we have an action. Something happens that changes the state of the system. In this case, the customer tries to withdraw $100 from their account. So we have this action happening in this context. The third ingredient into an example is the outcome. What happens when this action occurs in this context? Well, in this case, $100 is dispensed. Now, a really nice benefit of breaking examples up like this is that we can start to tease apart and start to ask questions about what if we mix up the ingredients? So, for example, are there any other outcomes that happen when this action happens in this context? Well, probably as well as giving us $100, we want to make sure that the bank remembers that we have $100 less in our account. So by breaking the example up like this, we can start to ask those questions and think about the finer details of what the behavior is that we want. Another question we might ask is whether there are different contexts where if this action happens, something different could be resulting in as an outcome. We might get a different outcome. So suppose we changed the balance to $50 and try and withdraw $100. We're going to get different behavior now, right? This time, we'll be told that we have insufficient funds and there's nothing debited from our account. Again, breaking the example down helps us to see the different pieces and how they fit together and think about mixing the ingredients up and coming up with new examples. So benefits of using examples, well, they're vivid. By working with real examples, real-world scenarios, it helps us to visualize the system and think about other cases that we might not have seen yet. It brings it to life. They can make for great tests. So once you've thought about different examples, they're going to help you to create either automated tests or manual tests for your system. They also start a conversation. Thinking about examples will help open up dialogue with domain experts about the realities of the system, the way they want it to behave. And compared to, say, technical tasks that you might talk about on your product backlog within your user stories, examples are the kind of thing that anyone on the team can talk about. They stay in the language of the problem space. So everyone from a programmer to a tester to a domain expert can join in conversations about examples. And as we showed earlier, they can help you to see scenarios that you might have missed. But this is really the secret about examples, about working with examples. And if you want to harness their power, they work best when you discover them in collaboration. So let's talk about some patterns for how that collaboration can work. This is a great pattern. I think it was George Dinwiddie that originally coined the term, this idea of the three Amigos. So most teams have someone with these three specialisms on them. There's people that develop code, people that test code, QA perhaps we might call them, and people who understand the problem space. Maybe it's a product owner, maybe it's a business analyst, someone who knows the details of how the system should behave. And if we can get those three Amigos together to have a conversation around a user story, ostensibly what they're going to do is they're going to produce a set of examples, right? They can have this conversation, they can come up with, here are all the different scenarios of the system and how it should behave in these different situations. But there's a couple of other things that can get captured in that conversation as well that are really valuable. we also want to try and capture the business rules. So each of those examples is going to be illustrating one or more business rules. For example, when we talked about the ATM earlier, we were saying that you couldn't withdraw $100 if you only had $50 in your account. Well, there's a business rule there, right? Because actually, if I have an overdraft, if I'm allowed an overdraft, maybe I can withdraw $100. So the business rule there that was implicit, we didn't talk about it yet, was that the user's not allowed to go over their overdraft. And talking about the rules as well as the examples, they complement each other and they help us to talk about scope. But sometimes the three amigos won't be able to answer all of the questions that they come up with. Maybe there's somebody missing, maybe we need to go off and do some more research, and actually capturing those known unknowns as questions or making assumptions that will enable us to carry the conversation on. But again, capturing that uncertainty, that lack of clarity, really, really helpful output from this conversation. And ultimately, what we get from working together to try and uncover the examples of how we want the system to behave is this nebulous, wonderful thing of shared understanding. We get these three perspectives to align and see the same thing for what we're going to build. And this is incredibly helpful, as you can imagine, as we go through the development of the story, that everybody's on the same page, everybody sees it the same way and understands the details of what's going to be built. So a really simple technique for facilitating this conversation is what I call example mapping. And you can do it if you're in person with just like a stack of 4 different colored index cards. You can buy them at stationery stores, really cheap, super simple, and make sure everyone's got a Sharpie in their hand. And you start by taking a yellow card and writing your user story on it. So for example, here I want to withdraw cash. Then we take a blue card and we can start to write business rules. So there's probably some idea that we already have of how we want the system to behave. Maybe there's a couple of different rules that we know about. So we can fill those in, and that sort of can help us to frame the conversation. But as we said earlier, examples are what really start to drive the conversation. So we can start to bring in examples, think about what are the examples around there being no overdraft? What happens if I try and withdraw more than my balance, or if the machines run out of bills? What happens in those situations? We can start to have that conversation. Maybe those conversations actually help us to discover new rules that we hadn't thought of. So maybe we come up with examples for those, or maybe we just have to park a question that nobody in the room knows how to answer right now. If your team is remote, there are lots of great tools now for running example mapping sessions online. In fact, Miro, which is a favorite of mine, comes with an example mapping template. So search that in Miro's template library, and it's got a great guide in there for how to run example mapping, what the difference is between examples and rules, and so on. Really great. Some tips for running successful example mapping sessions, some rules, if you like. One thing I really like to emphasize is to keep it short. Like, try and aim for about a 25-minute session around a single user story. If you feel like you need longer than that, I would suggest that the user story is too big. Or perhaps you're still just learning how to do example mapping, which is okay, but try and aim for a time box of about 20-25 minutes for a user story. And try and do it little and often. So rather than batching it up and having a big ceremony where you spend 3 hours example mapping everything for the next 2 weeks, try and just do it, 2 or 3 times a week, just to keep nibbling away and understanding the stories that you've got and getting them ready for development. Think about doing this work just in time. So we want to try and have those conversations fresh in our heads when we go off. Ideally, we're going to go off the next day and start implementing the code, right? Unless we came up with so many questions that we decide we aren't ready to build it yet. But assuming that, the few questions that we have seem okay, seem safe enough to build it, then we want to have a short time span between doing the example mapping conversation and starting to implement the code. So try and do this just in time. I recommend using a facilitator when you first start out. So as well as 3 amigos, have somebody there who's going to just help keep the conversation on track, and crucially, make sure everything is getting written down. The whole idea is that you use the cards to see what it is that you're talking about. So you want in real time to be capturing Are we talking about a rule? Are we talking about an example? Do we have a question here? And make sure somebody is conscious of that, as well as getting into the material of the specifics of what's being discussed about this particular user story. Try and encourage everybody to write. So make sure if you're doing it in person, everyone's got a Sharpie in their hand. The cards are accessible to everyone. It's not one person's job to write. The more of you are writing, the better, the more you will capture. But obviously you need to stay having one conversation at a time. So again, facilitation really helps. And another thing to point out is that although we talk about 3 amigos, 3 is really the minimum. If you want to bring other people along, that's great. Like user experience designers, really, really helpful people to have involved. They love these kinds of sessions. If you want to bring more than one developer along, that's all good. You got to find the right sweet spot for your team. Okay, that's hopefully given you a flavor of why we love examples so much in the BDD community. If you want to learn about how to do example mapping, if you're going to try nothing else about BDD, I really recommend trying to have that conversation, just like a 20-minute conversation about the user story where you bring everybody together before you start work on it. And there's a link to my blog post there where we discuss example mapping in more detail. All right, that's it from me for this time. Next session, we're going to be talking about formulation and automation, where we start to take those examples and turn them into automated tests. I look forward to seeing you then.